Before the blade fell on October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette endured something far worse than death itself. The woman who once wore diamonds worth kingdoms became prisoner 280, stripped of everything that made her human. This is not a story about execution. This is a story about systematic destruction, about how a nation tried to erase a woman so completely that even her name would be forgotten. What happened in those final months was not justice. It was vengeance, carefully orchestrated to break not just her body, but her very soul. The guillotine took only seconds, but the cruelty that preceded it lasted 76 days of calculated torture, designed to transform the Queen of France into nothing more than a number painted on a cell wall. History remembers the execution, but it has largely forgotten what came before: the deliberate annihilation of a mother, a woman, a human being. The revolutionaries did not simply want her dead. They wanted her humiliated, degraded, and erased from existence. And yet, in her final moments, Marie Antoinette would prove that dignity cannot be guillotined. Marie Antoinette arrived in France at age 14, a frightened Austrian princess sent to seal a political alliance. She was married to the future Louis XVI, thrust into the most dangerous court in Europe with no guidance, no allies, and no understanding of the vicious game she had entered. The French court was a theater of intrigue, where every gesture was scrutinized, every word could be weaponized, and every mistake would be remembered. She was foreign, she was young, and she was utterly unprepared for what awaited her. From the beginning, France despised her. The Austrian alliance was unpopular, and Marie Antoinette became the living embodiment of everything the French nobility resented about foreign influence. Pamphlets attacking her character began circulating before she even reached adulthood. She was called frivolous, wasteful, and immoral, though most accusations were fabrications designed to undermine the monarchy. The French gave her a cruel nickname that would follow her to the grave: l'Autrichienne, a play on words meaning both the Austrian woman and the Austrian bitch. The hatred was personal, visceral, and unrelenting. When revolution erupted in 1789, that hatred found its target. The storming of the Bastille was not simply about bread or taxes. It was about centuries of accumulated rage against a system that had crushed the common people beneath the weight of aristocratic excess. Marie Antoinette, with her elaborate hairstyles and expensive gowns, became the perfect symbol of everything that needed to be destroyed. Whether she actually said, "Let them eat cake," is historically disputed and likely false, but the phrase stuck because it confirmed what people already believed: that she was callous, disconnected, and contemptuous of their suffering. The royal family's attempted escape in June 1791 sealed their fate. Disguised as servants, they fled Paris in the dead of night, hoping to reach the Austrian border and safety. They were captured at Varennes, just 30 miles from freedom, and brought back to Paris in disgrace. The attempted flight shattered any remaining illusions that the king and queen might accept constitutional limits on their power. To the revolutionaries, it was proof of betrayal. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were no longer monarchs to be reformed, but traitors to be eliminated. The clock began ticking toward the guillotine. Louis XVI was executed on January 23, 1793, his head dropping into the basket before thousands of jubilant spectators. Marie Antoinette was forced to listen as the news reached her prison cell. The man she had married at 15, the father of her children, was dead. She did not cry out. She barely reacted. Those who witnessed her response noted that she seemed to retreat somewhere deep inside herself, to a place where the outside world could no longer reach her. It was a survival mechanism, but it would not be enough to protect her from what was coming. After her husband's execution, Marie Antoinette was transferred to the Temple Tower, a medieval fortress in Paris that had been converted into a high-security prison. She was kept with her two surviving children, Marie-Thérèse, age 14, and Louis-Charles, age 8. For a brief moment, despite the horror of their circumstances, she had her children close. She could still hold them, comfort them, pretend that somehow they might survive this nightmare together. It was the last mercy she would be granted. On July 3rd, 1793, Revolutionary Guards entered her cell in the middle of the night and tore her son from her arms. Louis Charles was taken to a cell below hers. She could hear him crying through the floor, screaming for his mother, begging to be returned to her. The guards had specific instructions. The boy was to be re-educated and taught to denounce his parents as tyrants and traitors. He was 8 years old. Marie Antoinette pressed her ear to the floor, listening to her son's sobs, powerless to comfort him. The separation was not an administrative decision. It was psychological warfare designed to break her completely. And for a time, it did. Witnesses reported that she stopped eating, stopped speaking, and spent hours staring at nothing, her hands trembling in her lap. On August 1st, 1793, at 2 o'clock in the morning, Marie Antoinette was moved to the conciergerie, the prison known as the antechamber of death. No one left the conciergerie except to face the guillotine. Her cell was 6 paces long and 7 paces wide, located below ground level, where the Seine's dampness seeped through the walls. The only furniture was a straw mattress crawling with lice, a wooden chair, and a table. There was no privacy. Guards watched her constantly, even when she used the chamber pot. She was no longer Marie Antoinette. She was prisoner 280, and the number painted on her cell door was meant to be her epitaph. The conciergerie was designed to strip prisoners of their humanity before they were stripped of their lives. The walls dripped with moisture, and the floor was perpetually slick with filth. Rats moved freely through the corridors, their scratching audible at all hours. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, human waste, and decay. Marie Antoinette, who had once slept in rooms filled with flowers and silk, now slept on moldy straw in a dress that was rotting off her body. She was 37 years old, but illness and grief had aged her dramatically. Her hair, once a source of vanity and pride, had turned completely white. She was not alone in the cell. 2 female guards, Rosalie Lamorlière and another woman, were assigned to watch her around the clock. Nothing she did was private. When she changed clothes, they watched. When she wept, they reported it. When she wrote letters to her surviving daughter, the words were read and analyzed for coded messages before being destroyed. Rosalie would later testify that Marie Antoinette rarely spoke, ate almost nothing, and spent most of her time sitting motionless, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the wall. She was being systematically dehumanized, reduced to an object of surveillance and scorn. Yet even in this hell, small acts of kindness emerged. Rosalie Lamorlière, despite her assignment as a guard, began to feel sympathy for her prisoner. She smuggled in better food when possible, spoke to her gently, and tried to make the cell more bearable. These small gestures meant everything to Marie Antoinette, who thanked her with a dignity that seemed impossible given the circumstances. Other prisoners in nearby cells reported hearing her pray at night, whispering the same words over and over, a prayer for her children, that they might survive what she could not. Marie Antoinette's health deteriorated rapidly. She developed severe hemorrhaging, likely from uterine cancer, and bled continuously. She had no proper medical care, no clean bandages, nothing to ease her suffering. The guards noted that her dress was often stained with blood, and she frequently fainted from blood loss and weakness. She was dying slowly, and everyone knew it, yet the Revolutionary Tribunal refused to delay her trial. They wanted her alive for the execution, but only just barely. The suffering itself was part of the punishment. In her final days of relative solitude before the trial, Marie Antoinette wrote letters to her sister-in-law and composed a final testament for her daughter. These letters reveal a woman who had been stripped of everything except her love for her children and her faith in God. She wrote of forgiveness, urging her children not to seek vengeance for what had been done to their family. She wrote of her innocence regarding the charges against her, but she also acknowledged her mistakes and asked for God's mercy. These letters are among the most moving documents in French history, a mother's final words to children she would never see again. Hidden in her corset, pressed against her heart, Marie Antoinette kept a lock of her son's blonde hair. She had cut it before he was taken from her, a small piece of him to carry into death. Guards discovered it during a search and confiscated it, but she begged so desperately to keep it that they eventually relented. That lock of hair was the only physical connection she had left to her children. She would touch it compulsively, running her fingers over the soft strands, whispering words only she could hear. It was both her greatest comfort and her deepest torment, a reminder of everything she had lost. On October 12, 1793, Marie Antoinette was informed that her trial would begin the next day. She was given no time to prepare a defense, no access to legal counsel, and no list of charges. The trial was a formality, the verdict already decided. She was to be found guilty and executed, and the proceedings were merely theater to give the execution a veneer of legitimacy. She spent that night on her knees, praying. Witnesses reported that she did not sleep at all, but remained in that position until dawn, her lips moving silently, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The trial of Marie Antoinette began at 8 o'clock in the morning on October 14, 1793, in the hall of the Revolutionary Tribunal. She was escorted into the room wearing a simple black mourning dress, a white cap covering her now white hair, and black gloves. She had not been allowed to wash or change clothes properly for weeks, and the dress hung loosely on her emaciated frame. Yet despite her physical deterioration, those present noted that she carried herself with remarkable composure. She sat in the defendant's chair, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm and distant, as though she had already transcended the accusations being hurled at her. The tribunal was not interested in justice. It was a show trial, designed to publicly humiliate the former queen and justify her execution. The president of the tribunal was Marshal Joseph Armand Herman, a fanatical revolutionary who had already decided her fate. The prosecutor was Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville, a man whose name would become synonymous with the terror's most brutal excesses. Fouquier-Tinville had prepared a list of charges so absurd, so slanderous, that even some revolutionaries found them excessive. But he knew that truth was irrelevant. The crowd wanted blood, and he would give it to them. The charges against Marie Antoinette were a mixture of political accusations and personal attacks. She was accused of conspiring with Austria against France, of draining the treasury to fund her extravagant lifestyle, and of orchestrating counter-revolutionary plots. These charges, while exaggerated, had some basis in the political reality of the time. But the tribunal did not stop there. They accused her of organizing orgies at Versailles, of corrupting the morals of the court, and of countless sexual indiscretions. The accusations grew more vicious and more personal with each passing hour, designed not to establish guilt, but to destroy her character so completely that the crowd would demand her death. For 16 hours, Marie Antoinette sat in that chair while witnesses paraded before her, each one adding another layer of slander and fabrication. Some were former servants who had been coerced or bribed to testify against her. Others were revolutionaries who had never met her, but were happy to repeat rumors as fact. She responded to each accusation with calm denial, her voice steady, her demeanor composed. When asked about the lavish spending at Versailles, she acknowledged that mistakes had been made, but insisted that she had never acted maliciously. When confronted with accusations of conspiracy, she pointed out that as queen, she had been expected to maintain relations with her native Austria, and that diplomacy was not treason. But then came the accusation that would define the trial. Jacques-René Hébert, a radical journalist and political agitator, took the stand and accused Marie Antoinette of sexual abuse. Specifically, he claimed that she had engaged in incestuous acts with her own son, Louis Charles. The accusation was so vile, so unthinkable, that even in that room full of revolutionaries, people shifted uncomfortably. There was no evidence, only the forced testimony of the 8-year-old boy who had been terrorized and coached by his guards into repeating whatever they told him to say. The child's testimony had been extracted through psychological torture, but it was presented as fact. For the first time during the trial, Marie Antoinette's composure cracked. She rose from her chair, her face pale, her eyes blazing with an emotion that had been absent for hours. She did not shout, she did not rage. Instead, she appealed directly to the women in the courtroom, bypassing the judges and prosecutors entirely. "I appeal to all mothers present," she said, her voice trembling with controlled fury. "Is such a crime possible?" The room fell silent. Even the most hardened revolutionaries could not ignore the raw pain in her voice, the absolute moral authority with which she spoke. For one brief moment, she was not the hated queen, but a mother defending her child and her honor. The impact was immediate. Several women in the audience began to weep. Even some of the jurors looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Fouquier-Tinville, sensing that the accusation had backfired, quickly moved to other charges, but the damage was done. Marie Antoinette had reminded everyone in that room that she was human, that she was a mother, and that some accusations were too monstrous to be believed. It was a moment of moral victory in a trial designed to deny her any dignity whatsoever. But moral victories do not stop guillotines. The trial continued into the night and resumed the following morning. Marie Antoinette was not permitted to sleep between sessions, another calculated cruelty designed to wear her down. By the time the prosecution rested its case, she had been awake for more than 40 hours, sitting in that chair, answering questions, defending herself against accusations that ranged from the political to the perverse. Her lawyer, Claude-François Chauveau-Lagarde, did what he could, but he had been given no time to prepare and was forbidden from calling witnesses in her defense. The outcome was never in doubt. On October 15th, at 4 o'clock in the morning, the jury retired to deliberate. They returned 1 hour later with their verdict, guilty on all counts. The sentence was death by guillotine, to be carried out the following day. Marie Antoinette listened to the verdict without expression, as though she had already accepted this outcome long ago. She was escorted back to her cell in the conciergerie, where she would spend her final hours on earth. She did not cry. She did not protest. She simply returned to her straw mattress and waited for dawn. Marie Antoinette spent her final night writing. By candlelight in a cell damp with the Seine's moisture, she composed a letter to her sister-in-law, Madame Elisabeth, who was also imprisoned and would herself be guillotined months later. The letter is one of the most moving documents in history, a testament to human dignity in the face of absolute degradation. She wrote of her love for her children, her forgiveness of her enemies, and her faith that God would welcome her into heaven. She asked that her daughter be taught to forgive those who had murdered her parents, that hatred not poison the next generation. She wrote with a steady hand, her words clear and purposeful, a final act of defiance against those who had tried to erase her. The letter was never delivered. It was confiscated by her guards and filed away in the archives, where it would remain for decades. Marie Antoinette never knew that her final words to her family would not reach them, that her plea for forgiveness and her declarations of love would be silenced. But she wrote them anyway, because in that moment, the act of writing was itself a form of resistance. They could take her life, her family, her dignity, but they could not stop her from expressing love. That was hers alone. At 6 o'clock in the morning on October 16, 1793, the executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, entered her cell. He carried scissors and rope. Marie Antoinette understood immediately what was about to happen, and she asked if she might be allowed to dress privately, one final moment of dignity before the end. Her request was denied. The guards watched as Sanson cut her hair, hacking it off roughly at the nape of her neck. Each snip of the scissors was an assault, removing the last vestiges of her identity. Her white hair fell to the ground in clumps, and she stared at the wall, her face expressionless, as though she had retreated to some unreachable place inside herself. Sanson then bound her hands behind her back. This was unusual. Louis XVI had been allowed to keep his hands free during his execution, a small gesture of respect for a former king, but Marie Antoinette was to be afforded no such courtesy. Her hands were tied so tightly that the rope cut into her wrists, and she would not be able to use them to steady herself during the journey to the scaffold. This was deliberate. Every indignity, every humiliation was calculated to strip her of the last shreds of her humanity. She was not to die as a queen or even as a person. She was to die as an object lesson in revolutionary justice. She was given a rough cotton shift to wear instead of her mourning dress. The shift was stained and ill-fitting, deliberately chosen to humiliate her. She was not permitted to wear undergarments, and the thin fabric clung to her emaciated body in a way that exposed her frailty. The revolutionaries wanted the crowd to see her weakness, to see that the once great queen was now nothing more than a broken woman. But as she stood there, hands bound, hair shorn, body trembling from illness and fear, something remarkable happened. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and looked at her guards with an expression that was neither defiant nor defeated. It was simply present, aware, and utterly composed. At 10 o'clock in the morning, Marie Antoinette was led from her cell and into the courtyard of the conciergerie. Waiting for her was not the enclosed carriage that had transported Louis XV to his execution, but an open cart, the kind used to transport common criminals. This, too, was deliberate. She was to be paraded through the streets of Paris like livestock, exposed to the jeers and insults of the crowd. A priest had been assigned to accompany her, a constitutional priest who had sworn allegiance to the revolutionary government. She refused his blessing, having rejected the constitutional clergy as illegitimate. She would die without the last rites of the Catholic Church, another small cruelty in a day filled with them. She climbed into the cart with difficulty, her hands bound behind her, making balance nearly impossible. The cart had no seat, only a rough wooden plank, and she was forced to sit facing backward so that the crowd could see her face as she passed. The journey from the conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution, where the guillotine waited, was approximately 2 miles. That journey would take more than an hour as the cart moved slowly through streets packed with spectators who had come to witness the death of the woman they had been taught to hate. The streets of Paris were a theater of cruelty. Tens of thousands of people lined the route, screaming insults, throwing refuse, and celebrating her impending death. "Death to the Austrian whore," they chanted. "Death to the tyrant." Revolutionary songs filled the air, and children were lifted onto their parents' shoulders so they could see the former queen in her final degradation. Jacques-Louis David, the revolutionary painter, sketched her as she passed, capturing her pale face, her bound hands, and her expression of distant composure. His sketch would become one of history's most famous images, a moment frozen in time showing a woman on her way to death. Yet those who were close enough to see her face reported something unexpected. Marie Antoinette was not crying. She was not begging for mercy or raging against her fate. She sat in that cart, hands bound, body swaying with each jolt of the wheels, and stared ahead with an expression of profound calm. Some described it as resignation, others as dignity, but all agreed that she seemed somehow beyond the reach of the mob's hatred. She had endured 76 days of imprisonment, a sham trial, and now this final humiliation, and yet something in her remained untouched, inviolate. It was as though she had already left this world and was simply waiting for her body to catch up. The cart turned onto the Rue Saint-Honoré, and the noise of the crowd grew even louder. Windows and balconies were filled with spectators, some cheering, others simply watching in silence. A few witnesses later reported that they saw tears on some faces, that not everyone in Paris that day was celebrating. But those voices were drowned out by the majority who had come to see justice as they understood it, finally delivered. The cart moved slowly forward, the horses' hooves clattering on the cobblestones, and Marie Antoinette swayed with each step, her eyes fixed on some distant point that only she could see. At 11:30 in the morning, the cart arrived at the Place de la Révolution, the square that had once been called the Place Louis XV. The guillotine stood in the center, its blade gleaming in the autumn sunlight. A massive crowd had gathered, estimated at over 20,000 people, all pressed together in a heaving mass of bodies, all screaming, all demanding her death. The noise was deafening, a physical force that seemed to press down from all sides. Marie Antoinette was helped down from the cart by the executioner's assistants, her bound hands making the descent difficult. She stumbled slightly, regained her balance, and then walked toward the scaffold with slow, measured steps. Charles-Henri Sanson, the executioner, later wrote his own account of those final moments. He described Marie Antoinette as calm, cooperative, and remarkably composed. She walked up the steps to the scaffold without assistance, despite her bound hands and her physical weakness. The crowd roared, anticipating the moment they had been promised, the moment when the Austrian woman who had symbolized their oppression would finally pay for her crimes. But Sanson noted something else in his account. As Marie Antoinette climbed those steps, she accidentally stepped on his foot. Without thinking, operating on instincts ingrained from decades of court etiquette, she turned to him and whispered, "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean to do it." Those words, spoken softly in the midst of chaos, became her final recorded utterance. "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean to do it." An apology for stepping on the foot of the man about to kill her. It was an automatic gesture of courtesy, an echo of the world she had been born into, where manners mattered and grace was expected even in the most mundane circumstances. But in that moment, in that context, it became something more. It was an act of defiance more powerful than any speech, any final declaration of innocence or rage. She was reminding everyone present that she was still human, still capable of consideration and kindness, even as they prepared to slaughter her. Sanson positioned her beneath the guillotine. She was made to kneel on the platform, her neck placed in the curved wooden brace that would hold her steady for the blade. Her bound hands meant she could not hold on to anything, and her body trembled with the effort of maintaining balance. The executioner's assistant secured the upper brace over her neck, locking her in position. Marie Antoinette closed her eyes. Whether she prayed or thought of her children or simply waited for it to be over, no one knows. Sanson stepped back, signaled to his assistant, and pulled the lever. The blade fell. It took less than a second. The sound was described by witnesses as a dull thud, followed by absolute silence. For one brief moment, the massive crowd that had been screaming for her death stood frozen, stunned by the finality of what they had just witnessed. Then the roar returned, louder than before, as people cheered and celebrated. Sanson picked up her severed head by the hair and held it aloft, displaying it to the crowd as was customary. Some witnesses reported that blood dripped onto the platform, pooling around her body, soaking into the wood that had absorbed the blood of so many others before her. Marie Antoinette's body and head were placed in a wicker basket and transported to the Madeleine Cemetery, a common burial ground for executed criminals. She was not given a coffin. Her remains were dumped into an unmarked grave and covered with quicklime, a chemical designed to accelerate decomposition. The revolutionaries wanted no shrine, no place where royalist sympathizers might gather to mourn. They wanted her erased, forgotten, reduced to nothing. For 22 years, her remains lay in that anonymous grave, mixed with the bones of other victims of the terror, indistinguishable and deliberately forgotten. But history does not forget. In 1815, after the fall of Napoleon and the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, a search was conducted to locate Marie Antoinette's remains. The Madeleine Cemetery had been closed and largely built over, but records indicated where she had been buried. A team of investigators exhumed the grave and found skeletal remains that were identified as hers based on several factors: the age and sex of the bones, the fact that the skull showed evidence of decapitation, and historical records that specified exactly where she had been placed. Also found were fragments of her mourning dress and the elastic garters she had been wearing when she died, marked with her initials. On January 21st, 1815, exactly 22 years after the execution of Louis XVI, the remains of Marie Antoinette and her husband were reinterred in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the traditional burial place of French royalty. It was a grand ceremony attended by the restored monarchy and foreign dignitaries, an attempt to reclaim the dignity that the revolutionaries had tried so hard to destroy. The couple who had died in disgrace, their bodies thrown into unmarked graves, were finally laid to rest with the honors befitting their station. But by then, the woman herself had been transformed into legend, into symbol, into myth. The legacy of Marie Antoinette is complicated and contested. To some, she remains a symbol of aristocratic excess and indifference, the embodiment of a system that needed to be destroyed. To others, she is a victim of political persecution, a woman who was demonized and destroyed, not for what she did, but for what she represented. The truth, as always, is more complex. Marie Antoinette made mistakes. She was extravagant when her country was starving. She was politically naive when cunning was required. She failed to understand the depth of rage building against the monarchy until it was too late to stop. But she was also a mother who loved her children, a woman who showed remarkable courage in the face of unimaginable cruelty, and a human being who deserved better than what she received. Her final hours reveal something essential about human dignity. The revolutionaries tried everything to break her, to reduce her to an object worthy only of destruction. They took her family, her health, her privacy, and ultimately her life. They subjected her to humiliations designed to strip away every last shred of her humanity. And yet, in those final moments, climbing the scaffold, accidentally stepping on the executioner's foot, and whispering an apology, she remained herself. That small gesture of courtesy, meaningless in the grand scheme of political revolution, became her most powerful act of resistance. They could kill her, but they could not make her cruel. They could humiliate her, but they could not make her lose her grace. The story of Marie Antoinette before the guillotine is not ultimately about the French Revolution, or the collapse of the monarchy, or the political forces that led to her execution. It is about what happens when a society decides that someone is no longer human, no longer deserving of basic dignity or mercy. It is about the systematic destruction of a person, carried out methodically over 76 days of imprisonment, culminating in a public execution designed to serve as both punishment and entertainment. And it is about the fact that even under those circumstances, human dignity proved impossible to completely destroy. The image of Marie Antoinette in that cart, hands bound behind her back, hair shorn, dressed in rags, facing the jeering mob with calm composure, has endured for more than 2 centuries. It endures because it speaks to something universal in the human experience, the capacity to maintain grace under pressure, to hold on to one's humanity even when the world is trying to strip it away. The revolutionaries wanted to make an example of her, to show that no one, not even a queen, was beyond the reach of revolutionary justice. But what they actually created was a different kind of example, a demonstration that dignity is not granted by titles or wealth, but is an intrinsic quality that cannot be taken away by force. Marie Antoinette's story asks uncomfortable questions. What do we become when we dehumanize others? What is lost when we transform people into symbols and then destroy those symbols? The crowd that cheered her execution believed they were witnessing justice. They believed they were correcting centuries of oppression, that her death would somehow balance the scales and create a better world. But the terror that followed her execution would claim thousands more lives, many of them ordinary people whose only crime was being accused by the wrong person. The revolution that began with promises of liberty, equality, and fraternity descended into paranoia, violence, and mass murder. Marie Antoinette was not the last victim. She was just the most famous. In the end, the revolutionaries failed in their primary objective. They wanted to erase her, to make her a forgotten footnote in the grand narrative of revolutionary progress. Instead, they made her immortal. Her final moments have been the subject of countless books, films, and historical analyses. Her composure in the face of death has been held up as an example of courage and dignity. The very cruelty with which she was treated has made her sympathetic to generations who might otherwise have seen her only as a symbol of aristocratic excess. By trying so hard to destroy her, the revolutionaries ensured that she would never be forgotten. Marie Antoinette died at 12:15 in the afternoon on October 16, 1793. She was 37 years old. She had been Queen of France for 19 years, a prisoner for 4 years, and prisoner 280 for 76 days. In those final seconds, as the blade fell, did she think of her children? Did she remember the gardens of Versailles, or the small hamlet where she had played at being a shepherdess, pretending for a few hours that she was not trapped in a gilded cage? Did she feel relief that the suffering was finally ending? No one knows. What we know is that she faced her death with a dignity that should have been impossible given what she had endured. And that dignity, more than anything else, is what history remembers. The guillotine that killed Marie Antoinette was not retired after her execution. It continued to operate for another year, claiming thousands more victims during the height of the terror. Maximilien Robespierre, who had signed her death warrant, would himself be guillotined less than a year later. The revolutionary tribunal that condemned her would be abolished. The men who prosecuted her would die, or flee, or be consumed by the same violence they had unleashed. The revolution ate its children, as revolutions always do, and the dream of perfect justice through mass execution proved to be an illusion. But Marie Antoinette's final moments endured, passed down through witness accounts, memoirs, and historical records, a testament to what one woman could still be even when everything had been taken from her. There is a plaque today at the Conciergerie, marking the cell where Marie Antoinette spent her final 76 days. Tourists visit it, take photographs, and try to imagine what those weeks must have been like. The cell has been preserved, or rather reconstructed, as a memorial to her suffering. It is small, dark, and damp, and even now, more than 2 centuries later, standing in that space for more than a few minutes becomes uncomfortable. She lived there for over 2 months, watched constantly, denied privacy, bleeding from untreated illness, separated from her children, waiting for the death she knew was coming. The cell is a reminder that history is not just about grand political movements and revolutions. It is also about individual human suffering, about what we do to each other when we forget that our enemies are also human beings. The story of what really happened to Marie Antoinette before the guillotine is ultimately a story about cruelty and grace. The cruelty is evident in every detail: the calculated humiliations, the separation from her children, the sham trial, the journey through Paris in an open cart while thousands screamed for her death. The revolutionaries who designed her final months believed they were administering justice, but what they actually created was systematic torture, designed to break her spirit before breaking her body. They wanted her to die not just physically, but spiritually and emotionally, to be so utterly destroyed that nothing remained to remember. They failed. The grace is evident in those small moments that defined her final hours. The appeal to all mothers during her trial, the letter she wrote in her final night expressing forgiveness and love, the apology to the executioner for stepping on his foot. These were not dramatic gestures or grand statements. They were quiet acts of humanity in circumstances designed to strip humanity away. They cost her nothing and gained her nothing, and yet they defined her legacy more completely than any crown or throne ever could. In her final moments, Marie Antoinette proved that dignity is not about power or wealth. It is about how we treat others when we have nothing left to lose. Her death did not end the story. Her daughter, Marie-Thérèse, survived the terror and was eventually released in a prisoner exchange. She would spend the rest of her life trying to piece together what had happened to her family, searching for information about her mother's final days, preserving every scrap of evidence that might help the world understand what they had endured. Her son, Louis Charles, was not so fortunate. He died in prison at age 10, brutalized and neglected, his death hushed up and his burial unmarked. The boy Marie Antoinette had cradled in her arms, whose hair she had carried in her corset to the scaffold, died alone in a cell below the one where she had been held, never knowing that his mother had fought to her last breath to protect his name. The lock of hair that Marie Antoinette treasured in her final days was eventually returned to the royal family and is now preserved as a relic. It is a small thing, a few strands of blonde child's hair, but it carries immense weight. It represents everything she lost, everything she fought to hold on to, and everything the revolutionaries tried to destroy. That lock of hair survived when so much else was lost. A tangible connection between a mother and a son that even death could not sever. It is displayed now in museums behind glass, a reminder that before she was a queen or a prisoner or a symbol, Marie Antoinette was a mother who loved her children with a ferocity that no political ideology could extinguish. The witnesses to her execution left behind contradictory accounts, as witnesses often do. Some described her as broken and defeated, a woman who had been utterly destroyed by her ordeal. Others described her as proud and defiant, refusing to give her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her broken. The truth is likely that she was both and neither. She was a human being facing the most extreme circumstances imaginable, and she responded with all the complexity that implies. She was terrified and brave. She was broken and unbreakable. She was defeated by her circumstances and triumphant in her dignity. These contradictions do not diminish her story. They make it more human. One witness, a young woman named Rosalie Lamolière, who had served as her guard, later testified about Marie Antoinette's final night in the conciergerie. Rosalie described how the former queen had stayed awake all night, writing her letters and praying. She described how Marie Antoinette had carefully folded her final letter and addressed it, knowing it would likely never reach its destination. She described the moment when the executioner arrived at dawn, and how Marie Antoinette had shown no surprise, no protest, as though she'd been expecting him. Rosalie wept as she gave her testimony, overcome by the memory of those final hours. She had witnessed countless prisoners pass through the conciergerie on their way to death, but Marie Antoinette's dignity had shaken her deeply. Charles-Henri Sanson, the executioner, also left a detailed account of the execution. He was a professional who had overseen hundreds of deaths during the terror, and his writings are typically clinical and detached. But his account of Marie Antoinette's execution contains notes of something else, something that might be called reluctant admiration. He described her composure, her cooperation, and her apology for stepping on his foot. He noted that she climbed the scaffold without assistance and positioned herself without complaint. He wrote that in all his years as executioner, he had never seen anyone face death with greater dignity. This from a man whose job required him to witness death daily, whose hands had killed more people than he could count. Even he recognized that what he had witnessed that day was extraordinary. The apology itself has been analyzed and reanalyzed by historians, psychologists, and writers. What does it mean to apologize to your executioner? Some see it as evidence of Stockholm Syndrome, a woman so broken that she instinctively sought approval from her captors. Others see it as deeply ingrained court training, reflexive politeness that transcended rational thought. Still others see it as a deliberate choice, a final assertion of her values in the face of violence. Perhaps it was all of these things. Perhaps it was none of them. What matters is that in a moment when most people would be consumed by terror, by rage, by despair, Marie Antoinette found room for courtesy. That small gesture contains multitudes. The French Revolution promised liberty, equality, and fraternity. It promised to create a society where birth did not determine worth, where all people would be equal before the law, where reason and justice would replace superstition and tyranny. These were noble goals, revolutionary in the truest sense. But the path to those goals was paved with bodies, and Marie Antoinette's was among the first of the royals to fall. The revolution that promised equality treated her with spectacular inequality, denying her the basic rights it claimed to champion. The revolution that promised liberty imprisoned her in conditions designed to destroy her sanity. The revolution that promised fraternity transformed her into an object of hatred, a symbol to be destroyed rather than a person to be judged fairly. This contradiction is at the heart of revolutionary violence. When we decide that certain people are not really people, that they are symbols or obstacles or enemies of progress, we grant ourselves permission to treat them in ways we would never treat those we recognize as human. The crowd that cheered Marie Antoinette's execution did not see a 37-year-old woman dying of cancer, separated from her children, facing death with remarkable courage. They saw the Austrian woman, the embodiment of everything wrong with the old regime. By transforming her into a symbol, they made her death not just acceptable, but necessary and righteous. This is how ordinary people participate in extraordinary cruelty, by forgetting that the target of their hatred is human. Marie Antoinette's final words to the executioner, that simple, "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean to do it," stands in stark contrast to the dehumanization she experienced. She did not see Charles-Henri Sanson as a symbol of revolutionary justice or an instrument of her destruction. She saw him as a person whose foot she had accidentally stepped on, someone deserving of an apology. In that moment, she was more revolutionary than the revolutionaries, more committed to treating others with basic human dignity than those who claimed to be building a society based on fraternity. The irony is profound and painful. The journey from Versailles to the guillotine took 4 years, but the real destruction happened in those final 76 days in the Conciergerie. That was when the process of dehumanization reached its conclusion, when prisoner 280 replaced Queen Marie Antoinette in all official records. The revolutionaries understood that execution alone was not enough. They needed to destroy her psychologically and spiritually before they destroyed her physically. The separation from her children, the constant surveillance, the deliberate humiliations, the sham trial with its vile accusations, all of this was designed to break her completely, to ensure that she died not as a martyr, but as a defeated, destroyed object of contempt. They failed because they underestimated human resilience. They failed because dignity is not something that can be stripped away by force. They failed because in their determination to make her less than human, they revealed their own inhumanity. Marie Antoinette's composure on the scaffold was not a victory in any meaningful political sense. The revolution continued, the monarchy was destroyed, and France was transformed. But it was a victory of the human spirit over cruelty, a demonstration that even in the darkest circumstances, people can choose how they respond. She could not choose her fate, but she could choose her bearing, and she chose grace. The physical suffering she endured in those final weeks is difficult to fully comprehend. The cancer that was slowly killing her caused constant bleeding and pain. She had no proper medical care, no pain relief, nothing to ease her suffering. She was malnourished, weak, and frequently faint from blood loss. Her guards reported that she often could not stand without assistance, that she trembled constantly from illness and weakness, and yet, when the moment came to walk to the scaffold, she walked. When the time came to climb the steps, she climbed them without help. The human body is capable of extraordinary things when the mind refuses to surrender, and Marie Antoinette's final physical acts were a testament to willpower overcoming extreme bodily deterioration. The psychological suffering was perhaps even worse. The separation from her children was a wound that never healed. She could hear her son crying through the floor of her cell, could hear him calling for her, and could do nothing. This was not an accidental cruelty, but a calculated one, designed specifically to maximize her suffering. The revolutionaries understood that the most effective way to torture a mother was through her children. They used Louis Charles as a weapon against her, forcing him to testify against her, corrupting his innocence, and ultimately destroying him. By the time Marie Antoinette died, her son had already been psychologically broken, transformed from a sweet child into a confused, terrified boy who would not survive another year. The trial's accusation of incest was the ultimate attempt to destroy her character. It was not enough to execute her for political crimes. The revolutionaries wanted her to die with her name so thoroughly blackened that no one would dare defend her memory. The accusation was designed to strip away any sympathy, to make her execution not just acceptable, but necessary. That it backfired, that her appeal to all mothers present created a moment of shared humanity that transcended political hatred, must have frustrated those who had carefully orchestrated every other aspect of her destruction. For one brief moment, the crowd saw her as a mother rather than a monster. And in that moment, the entire project of dehumanization cracked. The revolution eventually consumed itself, as violent revolutions typically do. Robespierre, who had been one of the chief architects of the Terror, was guillotined in July 1794, less than a year after Marie Antoinette. The crowd that watched his execution was the same crowd that had cheered for her death, hungry for blood regardless of whose it was. The revolutionary tribunal was dissolved. The wholesale executions stopped. France eventually stabilized under Napoleon, and later the monarchy was briefly restored, and later still the republic was re-established. The political structures changed and changed again. But Marie Antoinette remained dead, her story frozen in that moment when the blade fell. What endures is not the political justification for her execution, but the human story of how she faced it. The letter she wrote in her final night is preserved and can be read today. Her words about forgiveness, about love for her children, about her faith that God would receive her, remain powerful more than 2 centuries later. They are the words of someone who knew she was about to die and chose to spend her final hours not in recrimination or despair, but in expressing love and seeking peace. This is not the behavior of the monster the revolutionaries tried to portray. This is the behavior of a woman of deep feeling and remarkable strength. The reconstruction of her final hours has become a historical obsession. Scholars have examined every detail, from the exact timing of events to the weather that day, to the number of people in the crowd. They have analyzed her clothing, her hair, the cart she rode in, the guillotine itself. They have tracked down every witness account, every memoir, every scrap of evidence that might illuminate what happened and how she responded. This obsessive documentation serves multiple purposes. It preserves historical truth against those who would deny or distort it. But it also represents a kind of collective guilt, a need to bear witness to what was done, to ensure that her suffering is not forgotten or minimized. Marie Antoinette's execution was meant to be a moment of triumph for the revolution, a symbolic killing that would demonstrate the power of the people over their former oppressors. In some ways, it succeeded. The execution did demonstrate that power, did show that titles and birth offered no protection from revolutionary justice, but it also revealed the revolution's capacity for cruelty, its willingness to torture and humiliate in the name of justice. The treatment of Marie Antoinette in her final months stands as one of history's clearest examples of how political ideology can justify inhuman treatment. how the desire for symbolic victory can override basic human decency. The question that haunts her story is simple. Was this necessary? Could the revolution have succeeded without subjecting her to such extreme cruelty? Could she have been tried fairly, or exiled, or imprisoned humanely? The answer is almost certainly yes. Other revolutions have managed to dismantle monarchies without resorting to such theatrical brutality. But the French Revolution was not simply about political change. It was about vengeance, about settling scores accumulated over centuries of oppression. Marie Antoinette became the target for all of that accumulated rage, the symbol onto which every grievance could be projected. Her actual guilt or innocence was beside the point. She was going to die because the revolution needed her to die, because her death would satisfy something deep and dark in the revolutionary psychology. Understanding this does not require us to romanticize Marie Antoinette or to ignore the very real problems with the monarchy she represented. The old regime was unjust, oppressive, and long overdue for dismantling. The French people had legitimate grievances, and political change was necessary. But acknowledging these truths does not require us to celebrate her execution or to pretend that her treatment was just. It is possible to recognize both that revolution was necessary and that the revolutionaries committed terrible cruelties. History is not simple, and the people who populate it are not symbols. They are complex, flawed, suffering human beings who deserve to be remembered as such. The image of Marie Antoinette climbing the scaffold steps, hands bound behind her back, body weakened by illness, facing a screaming mob with calm composure, has become iconic. It appears in countless paintings, films, and written accounts. But the power of that image is not about her royalty or her former position. It is about her humanity in circumstances designed to strip it away. Anyone can be brave when surrounded by supporters and strength. To maintain dignity when everything has been taken, when death is seconds away, when the entire world seems to be screaming for your destruction, that requires something extraordinary. That is what makes her final moments worthy of remembrance. The story of what really happened to Marie Antoinette before the guillotine is a story that should make us uncomfortable. It should challenge us to think about how we treat those we consider enemies, about the distance between justice and vengeance, about the ease with which ordinary people can participate in extraordinary cruelty when they believe they are serving a greater good. It should remind us that dehumanization is a process, that it begins with transforming people into symbols and ends with treating them as objects worthy only of destruction. And it should inspire us with the knowledge that even under the most extreme circumstances, human dignity can survive. Marie Antoinette died more than 200 years ago, but her final hours continue to resonate because they ask questions that remain relevant. How do we treat those who have fallen from power? What is the difference between justice and revenge? When does punishment become cruelty? What does it mean to maintain one's humanity in inhuman circumstances? These are not historical questions. They are moral questions that every generation must answer for itself. Marie Antoinette's story provides one answer, written not in words, but in actions, in the way she faced her death when facing it with grace should have been impossible. The revolutionaries wanted to destroy her so completely that nothing would remain. They wanted her forgotten, erased, reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale about the fate of tyrants. Instead, they created a legend that has endured for more than 2 centuries. They wanted her to die as a symbol of everything wrong with the old regime. Instead, she died as a testament to human dignity, courage, and grace under unimaginable pressure. They wanted her final moments to be a triumph for the revolution. Instead, those moments revealed the revolution's capacity for cruelty and Marie Antoinette's capacity for transcendence. In the end, what really happened to Marie Antoinette before the guillotine was both simpler and more complex than the legends suggest. She was imprisoned, humiliated, separated from her children, subjected to a sham trial, and executed. These are the facts, brutal and undeniable. But she was also something more. She was a woman who loved her children with devastating intensity, who maintained her dignity when it would have been easier to surrender to despair, who found room for courtesy even in her final moments, who refused to be reduced to the symbol her enemies needed her to be. The revolutionaries could take her life, but they could not take her humanity. That remained hers until the very end, and it remains hers still, preserved in the historical record, a testament to the enduring power of grace in the face of cruelty. At 12:15 p.m. on October 16, 1793, the blade fell, and Marie Antoinette's suffering ended. But her story did not end. It continues in every retelling, every analysis, every moment when someone reads about her final hours and feels moved by her courage. The guillotine that killed her has long since been dismantled. The revolutionary tribunal that condemned her has been dissolved for more than 2 centuries. The men who prosecuted her are forgotten except as footnotes in her story. But Marie Antoinette endures, not because she was a queen, but because in her darkest hour she showed us what it means to be human. That is her true legacy, and it is one that no revolution, no matter how thorough, could ever destroy.